I need to tell you something before I tell you what she did. For 26 years, I never once asked to see my father's actual death certificate. My mother kept a framed obituary on the mantel my whole childhood, and that was always enough for me. Then she died herself 6 weeks ago, and the estate attorney needed a certified copy of his death certificate to release a $40,000 trust, naming him as a contingent beneficiary. The county had no record of it at all. Not a misfiling. Not a typo. No death. No certificate. Nothing on file anywhere because as far as the state is concerned, my father never died. I'm Ren. I'm 34 years old. And this is the story of how I found out my mother spent over 2 decades paying my very much alive father to stay disappeared and let me grieve a man who was never actually gone. I grew up in a small house that always felt bigger than it was my mother, filling every room with the specific determined warmth of someone building a life alone on purpose. She worked long shifts, never once complained about it in front of me, and turned every ordinary Tuesday into something that felt at the time completely whole. I would have told you without a second's hesitation that I understood exactly what my childhood was built on. I understood almost none of it. It turns out not the part that mattered most. I work as a professional heir finder, a skip tracer for a probate research firm, tracking down missing beneficiaries and lost relatives entitled to inheritances they don't even know exist. My whole job is locating people who've fallen out of official records for one reason or another, sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, sometimes because a family made a quiet decision decades ago and simply never revisited it. I've reunited strangers with inheritances. Their own families couldn't find them for sometimes after decades of searching. I never once thought I'd end up running that exact search on my own father. My parents split up as far as I always understood it when I was 8. He died a year later, a car accident out of state. My mother always said quietly in the tone you use for things too painful to elaborate on, a tone that discourages follow-up questions almost by design. There was no funeral I attended, no body I ever saw. Just a framed newspaper clipping she kept on the mantel for the rest of her life. An obituary short enough that I could recite it from memory by the time I was 12. I never questioned it. Children generally don't question the story their surviving parent hands them. I certainly didn't. I didn't push on it later either, even when small things didn't quite add up over the years. At a cousin's wedding, distant enough family that I barely knew her, an older relative I'd never met leaned over during the reception and said almost fondly, "Your father always did have a flair for disappearing." I laughed along, assumed it was some dark family joke about the accident, and never once thought to ask what she actually meant. That's the thing nobody tells you about a lie this old. By the time you're finally in a position to question it, it's had decades to calcify into something that just feels like fact, indistinguishable from anything else you actually remember happening. I mentioned the wedding comment to my mother once years later, half joking over dinner, expecting her to laugh it off the way I had. She went quiet instead, just for a second long enough that I noticed it even at the time. Before she said lightly, "Aunt Inez always did have a strange sense of humor about hard things." I believed her. I had no particular reason not to, and every reason to want the boring explanation to be the true one. The complicating moment came a few months before my mother died, during one of our last real conversations in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic, and the flowers I'd brought that were already wilting faster than either of us wanted to acknowledge. She'd been quiet for a while, staring at the ceiling, and then she said out of nowhere, "Sometimes the kindest lie is the one you tell so long you start believing it yourself." I remember squeezing her hand and telling her that sounded very wise, assuming she was talking generally about grief, about the small, comforting fictions people tell themselves to get through hard years. I had no idea yet that she was talking about something specific, something she'd apparently decided even then not to say out loud plainly. The escalation started with a 30-day deadline, not a discovery. I need you to understand something before I keep going, because it matters for everything after this. I didn't start pulling records because I doubted my mother's love for me, or because I went looking for a reason to distrust the only parent I'd actually had growing up. I started because a woman who finds missing people for a living cannot sit across from an estate attorney, hear the words "no death record exists," and simply accept the boring explanation the way I might have if I did any other job. I remember sitting in my car in the attorney's parking lot afterward, engine off, just staring at the dashboard for a long time. 30 days. That's what he'd given me to sort it out, or the trust would revert to the state tangled up in a probate process that could take years to unwind if it ever fully did. I've explained that exact deadline to plenty of clients over the years, always from the calm professional side of the desk. Sitting on the other side of it felt like a different kind of math entirely. I pulled the state's vital records database myself, the same one I use constantly for client cases, searching my father's full legal name against every possible year, and state the cursor blinking over an empty results field for longer than felt reasonable for a search this routine. Nothing matched the accident story at all. What did turn up, eventually buried under a slightly different middle initial, was a man with his exact name, his exact birth date, alive and well, currently residing 3 states away. I need you to know something before I go further, because it recontextualizes everything I've told you up to here. The professional part of me, the part that finds missing people for a living, had already started running the exact search I'd run for a client on my own father before I even let myself admit out loud that's what I was doing. For the next several days, I kept building the picture instead of confronting it the way I always do with a real case, before I bring a client a conclusion that's going to reshape their whole understanding of a person. I pulled property records, found Roland, my father. Though the word felt strange, applying it to a stranger with a current address, remarried, living a full ordinary life. 3 states over, a stepdaughter's graduation photo tagged publicly online from just last spring, smiling in a way I'd genuinely never seen him smile in any photo my mother had kept of him. I sat with that photo open on my laptop for longer than I want to admit, studying a stranger's easy, unguarded smile, trying to reconcile it with the single serious, stiff photograph my mother had kept tucked in a drawer instead of on display. The only image I'd ever had of a man I'd spent my whole life believing was gone. I told my business partner and Dee Dee about it, eventually framing it at first as a strange hypothetical case, the way I sometimes do when I'm not ready to say something plainly, yet dressing my own life up as somebody else's file to make it easier to talk about out loud. She didn't buy the hypothetical framing for a second. We've run cases together long enough that she knows exactly what my voice sounds like when I'm describing a real file instead of a made-up one. "Pull the estate's old financial records," she said. "If your mother was managing this for 26 years, there's a money trail somewhere. There always is." It was good advice, and advice I already knew professionally. I just hadn't thought to point it at my own family's finances yet. As executor of my mother's estate, I had legal access to 2 decades of her old banking records boxes of paper statements she'd never digitized, stacked in her hall closet, exactly where she'd left everything else. I spent a full weekend going through them, cross-referencing wire transfers against a small, recurring annual payment, never large, always sent in the same week each year to an account that, once I traced the routing information, matched exactly to Roland's current legal name. I did that weekend, the same way I'd approach any client's file spreadsheets, dates lined up chronologically, nothing left to memory or assumption. Somewhere around hour 6, sitting on my mother's living room floor, surrounded by decades of her handwriting on old check stubs, it stopped feeling like professional work entirely and started feeling like something much heavier, harder to hold steady. I kept having to remind myself to breathe normally, the way you do when you're reading something your body understands is important before your mind has fully caught up. 26 years. Nearly the same small amount sent every single year without fail to a man the rest of the world believed had died before I turned 10. I sat with the full timeline for 3 days before I did anything with it. I went to work. I ran other people's family searches calm as anything while quietly finishing my own in the background. There's a particular kind of loneliness in investigating your own dead parents' decisions using the exact tools you use for total strangers. Nobody warns you about that part. A county records clerk named Junko, who I'd worked with professionally on other cases over the years, helped me pull the original uncertified paperwork trail from 26 years back, Not a death filing since none existed, but a formal separation agreement quietly notarized the same month the accident was supposed to have happened, filed in a different county than where we'd lived easy enough to miss. Unless you were specifically looking for it, which nobody ever had been. Not even a curious teenager doing a school project on family history a decade earlier. I drove out to Roland's address myself the following week, sat in my car outside his house for almost 10 minutes before I got out. Not because I was scared exactly, but because I wanted to be completely sure of every date before I let this become real. The street was quiet, ordinary. A kid 2 houses down practicing free throws in a driveway, completely indifferent to what was about to happen a few doors past him. I've built enough case files professionally to know you don't walk into a conversation like the one I was about to have with a hunch. You walk in with something that can survive somebody trying to argue with it. I brought the framed obituary with me, pulled straight off my mother's mantel, before I left for the drive, still in the same frame it had sat in for 26 years. He answered the door himself. Older than the photos I'd found online, grayer but unmistakably the same face from the one worn photograph my mother had kept tucked in a drawer instead of on display. He saw the frame in my hands before he fully registered who I was, and something in his face went completely still. Behind him, somewhere deeper in the house, I could hear a television playing ordinary Saturday afternoon sounds from a life that had been running fully uninterrupted for over 2 decades, without me in it. "Ren," he said, quiet, like he'd rehearsed the possibility of this moment more than once over the years, and still wasn't ready for it. I held up the frame. "You've been dead 26 years, according to this. You look pretty good for it." He stepped back from the doorway, not quite inviting me in, not quite closing the door either, caught somewhere in between the two, like he hadn't fully decided yet which version of this conversation he wanted to have. His hands resting on the door frame started shaking. Not dramatically, just a small, constant tremor. He seemed to notice himself a second after I did, glancing down at them like they belonged to someone else. He pushed them into his pockets as if hiding them might undo what I'd already seen. "I told myself it was the only way to actually stop hurting you," he said, voice unsteady. "I was drowning back then. Money, work, myself, all of it at once. And your mother gave me a choice. Disappear cleanly. Let her tell you something simple and final, or stay and watch you grow up watching me fail at everything over and over in front of you. I picked the version I thought would hurt you less. You picked the version that was easier for both of you," I said. "Not the one that was actually kinder to me." He didn't argue that. That was almost the worst part. No defense, no anger, just a man standing in his own doorway, hands still trembling in his pockets, finally saying a true thing out loud after 26 years of not having to. I asked him once why he never tried harder later, once he'd gotten his own life back together, to find some way back to me. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. Every year that passed made the lie feel more permanent than the truth would have been. I told myself you were better off believing something simple. I think somewhere in there that stopped being about you and started being about how much easier it was for me. For 1 second, just one, I saw exactly why he'd agreed to it. A man so ashamed of his own failure that erasing himself entirely felt kinder than staying and being watched fail in real time, year after year, in front of the one person whose opinion of him mattered most. And then that second passed, and I was just standing on a stranger's porch, holding a framed lie, looking at a father who'd let 2 decades of quiet payments substitute for 26 years of actually being my father. I want to tell you it ended there, clean and complete, on that porch. It didn't. What ended there was the version of both my parents I'd built my entire understanding of my own childhood around. What came after took much longer, and some of it is still unfolding slower and messier than any tidy ending would suggest. It wasn't until almost 2 weeks later, going back through the last of my mother's old paperwork, that I found the full shape of the arrangement, not just the annual payments, but a short handwritten letter from Roland tucked behind a stack of old tax returns, dated just a few months after he'd left. In it, he'd asked plainly whether he could still see me sometimes quietly, without disrupting whatever story she was telling me. My mother's reply, a carbon copy she'd apparently kept for herself, was 2 sentences long. A clean break is kinder for her than a complicated one. Let her have one simple story instead of two confusing parents. I read that carbon copy probably a dozen times sitting on the same living room floor where I'd first found the bank statements, trying hard to reconcile the woman who wrote those two clipped, decisive sentences with the mother who'd sung me to sleep for years, who'd cried at every one of my school plays, who'd built an entire warm, whole-feeling childhood around a decision this cold at its foundation. Both of those women were real. I don't think I'll ever fully stop being unsettled by how easily they lived inside the same person. That letter answered a question I hadn't even let myself ask yet. Whether the choice to keep me from him had ever really been about protecting me, or about how much simpler grief is to manage than an ongoing, awkward, real relationship with a father who'd failed. I don't think my mother was a villain for believing what she believed. I think she made a decision young and scared and drowning in her own way, and then spent the rest of her life too committed to it to ever walk it back. Here's where I actually am with all of this now. I've spoken to Roland twice more since that first porch conversation, careful tentative calls that don't yet feel like anything close to a real relationship, but don't feel like nothing either. The first call lasted 11 minutes and consisted mostly of silence and small, careful questions, the kind two strangers ask each other at the very beginning of deciding whether to keep talking at all. The second call was longer, easier in places I didn't expect, harder in others I did. I don't know what to call this yet. The thing we're rebuilding, if that's even the right word for something that never actually existed in the first place, to be rebuilt at all. Indeed, he asked me recently whether I thought I'd ever actually call him Dad again out loud, and I honestly didn't have an answer for her. Some days the word feels available. Other days it still feels like it belongs to a person I only ever knew through a framed newspaper clipping, not an actual man with shaking hands standing in a doorway. I went to see my mother's grave last weekend for the first time since the funeral, and stood there longer than I meant to, trying to figure out how angry I was actually allowed to be at a woman who spent her whole life loving me in every way I could see, while also making one enormous unilateral decision about my life that I never got any say in at all. I still don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure grief and anger are supposed to fit together cleanly in the first place. The framed obituary is still sitting in a box in my apartment. I haven't decided what to do with it, throw it out, which feels like erasing a version of my own childhood that, however false, still shaped every year of it. Or keep it somewhere, not on a mantel this time, just somewhere I can look at when I need reminding of exactly how long a kind-sounding lie can hold, if enough people agree not to ask the one question that would have broken it open years sooner. Some nights I take it out of the box anyway, just to read the obituary itself again, the same handful of sentences I could recite from memory by the time I was 12. It's strange rereading a lie you've had memorized since childhood, knowing now exactly which parts of it were true, his name, his birthday, the fact that he existed at all, and which parts were simply the version my mother decided I was allowed to grieve. I don't know yet what this family looks like going forward, or whether family is even the right word for whatever Roland and I are slowly, carefully building out of the wreckage of a story that held for 26 years. I just know I'm done accepting a frame at face value without ever once asking what's actually behind the glass.